The town of Maplewood wasn't big, but it had heart. People knew each other, helped each other, and lived by a quiet, unspoken code. Family first, always. And no one embodied that more than Ray Johnson. At 46, Ray was a man of simple values. He worked hard, provided for his family, and never let anyone down. He was a truck driver by trade, spending long weeks on the road, hauling loads across state lines to keep food on the table. It wasn't glamorous work, but it was honest, and Ray took pride in that. His wife, Linda, had been the love of his life for nearly 2 decades. They married young, built a home together, and raised their daughter, Emily, who was 10 going on 20, with the way she always had an opinion about everything. She was the center of Ray's world, and every mile he drove, every late night spent behind the wheel, was for her future. When Ray wasn't working, he was the kind of man people gravitated toward. He was the first to lend a hand, whether it was helping a neighbor fix a fence or coaching the local kids' softball team. He had a way of making people feel safe, like they could count on him no matter what. And they could. Ray Johnson was a man of his word. What he didn't know, what he could never have imagined, was that the 2 people closest to him were about to betray him in a way that would break him beyond repair. Ray had always known that trucking wasn't easy on a marriage. It took a certain kind of woman to handle the long absences, the late-night calls from lonely highways, the stretches of days when all she had were text messages and voicemails. For years, Linda had been that woman. She held down the home front, raised Emily, and kept things running while Ray was away. But lately, something had changed. Ray felt it in the little things, the way she kissed him goodbye without looking into his eyes, the way she turned away from him in bed, as if the space between them had become something more than just a mattress. He told himself it was just life, just the wear and tear of years together. But doubt had a way of creeping in, especially on the long nights alone in his truck. One evening, just before his latest trip, Ray found Linda sitting on the back porch, staring at the sunset, with a faraway look in her eyes. He sat beside her, reached for her hand, but she pulled away, brushing her hair back like she hadn't noticed his touch. "You okay?" he asked, studying her. She forced a smile. "Yeah, just tired." He wanted to believe her, but deep down, he knew better. What he didn't know was that Linda wasn't just tired. She was lonely, and lonely people make dangerous choices. Henry Lawson had been Ray's best friend since they were kids. They'd grown up in the same neighborhood, played on the same baseball team, and stood by each other through every high and low. If there was one person Ray trusted without question, it was Henry. Henry was the kind of man who could talk his way into or out of anything. He was charming, quick-witted, and had a way of making people feel like they were the most important person in the room. Over the years, Henry had become part of Ray's family. He was Uncle Henry to Emily, the guy who showed up for birthdays, barbecues, and every little milestone in between. When Ray was away, Henry was the one who stopped by to check in on Linda, to help with whatever needed fixing. It was just what best friends did. At least, that's what Ray thought. What he didn't see, what he never could have imagined, was that every time he left town, Henry and Linda were getting closer. Too close. It started small. A leaky faucet, a broken step on the back porch. Henry was always there to help, always ready to step in where Ray couldn't. And at first, it was innocent. Then it wasn't. One night, after a long evening of fixing a light fixture in the kitchen, Henry and Linda sat on the couch, sharing a drink. The conversation turned personal, too personal. You ever think about what life would have been like if things were different? Henry asked, his voice low. Linda hesitated. Different how? Henry swirled the whiskey in his glass, watching her. If we had met first. A silence stretched between them, thick and charged. Then it happened. A touch, a kiss, a choice. And once the line was crossed, there was no going back for weeks. Linda and Henry lived a double life. To the outside world, nothing had changed. Linda still kissed Ray goodbye when he left for work. Henry still clapped him on the back and shared beers with him on the porch. But behind closed doors, secrets festered. Every time Ray left town, Henry found his way back to Linda. Guilt gnawed at her, but the thrill, the attention, the desire was stronger. And Henry, he had spent years in Ray's shadow, always the second choice, always looking at the life Ray had built. Now, he had a piece of it, and he didn't want to give it up. But secrets don't stay buried forever. And one night, everything unraveled. Ray finished his route a day early. He didn't call ahead. He wanted to surprise Linda and Emily, to see the look on their faces when he walked through the door. But when he pulled into the driveway, something felt off. The house was dark, except for the faint glow of the bedroom light upstairs. Then he heard it, a sound that made his stomach turn. A laugh, a moan. Ray's blood ran cold. He stepped forward, moving slowly, carefully. As he reached the staircase, his breath caught in his throat. It was Linda's voice, and she wasn't alone. Ray turned away, his hands shaking. He walked downstairs, his mind a storm of rage and heartbreak. He didn't cry, he didn't yell. Instead, he walked to the cabinet, opened it, and pulled out the shotgun. And then he went back upstairs. The bedroom door slammed open, shaking the walls. Linda and Henry shot up, their faces frozen in horror. Ray stood in the doorway, the shotgun in his hands. "You are my brother," he said, his voice hollow. Henry stammered, hands raised. Linda screamed. Ray pulled the trigger. A deafening explosion. And then, silence. The sound of the shotgun blast echoed through the house, silencing everything in an instant. Henry lay motionless on the bed, his body twisted unnaturally, blood seeping into the sheets. Linda screamed, a raw, broken sound that barely registered in Ray's ears. He stood frozen in the doorway, the shotgun still clutched in his shaking hands. For a moment, time stopped. Then, from the hallway, a small, trembling voice shattered the silence. "Daddy!" Ray turned, his breath catching in his throat. Emily stood there, her tiny frame barely visible in the dim light. Her wide, terrified eyes darted between her parents, the father with the gun, the mother screaming, and the lifeless man on the bed. Ray felt his world collapse in on itself. His little girl had seen everything. His rage had blinded him, consumed him, and in the end, it had made him the very thing he never thought he could be, a monster in his daughter's eyes. The sirens wailed in the distance, growing louder. The weight of what he had done settled on his chest like a crushing force. He had lost everything in a single moment of rage, and there was no taking it back. Ray sat on the porch steps, hands cuffed behind his back, his face blank. The house, once his sanctuary, was now swarming with officers, their radios buzzing, their voices sharp and urgent. Linda was inside, wrapped in a blanket, sobbing as she recounted the events of the night. Emily was gone, whisked away by child services, taken somewhere safe, away from the horror her father had unleashed. Ray didn't resist when the officers lifted him to his feet. He didn't fight when they read him his rights. His whole life he had prided himself on being a man people could count on, a good husband, a good father, a man who did things the right way. But in the end, all it had taken was one moment of betrayal to unravel everything. "Ray Johnson, you're under arrest for the murder of Henry Lawson," the officer said. Ray barely heard the words. The only thing he could hear was the last thing Emily had said to him. "Daddy." That single word would haunt him for the rest of his life. The courtroom was packed. The town that had once admired Ray now looked at him with pity, disgust, and whispered judgment. Linda took the stand, her voice trembling. He just lost control," she said, wiping her tears. "I never thought he was capable of something like this." Emily wasn't there. Ray had made sure of that. He had told his lawyer he wouldn't let his daughter see him like this, wouldn't let her relive that night. The prosecution painted him as a man driven by jealousy and rage, a murderer, a man who let his emotions destroy everything in his path. His defense attorney tried to argue temporary insanity, that the betrayal had pushed Ray to a breaking point no man could withstand. But it didn't matter. The verdict came swiftly. Guilty. The sentence, life in prison. Ray didn't flinch. He had already sentenced himself the night he pulled the trigger. Prison was a slow death. The walls never changed, the days blurred together, and the silence had a way of suffocating a man. Ray kept to himself. He wasn't violent. He wasn't angry. He was just empty. Emily sent letters sometimes. She told him about school, about how she missed him, about how she still loved him despite everything. But Ray never wrote back. What could he say? That he was sorry, that he wished he could take it all back, that every night he lay awake replaying the moment he let his rage consume him. She deserved more than his regrets, so he let her go. One day, a guard told him Linda had remarried, that she had moved away, started fresh. Ray felt nothing, because he had lost the right to feel anything for her the moment he pulled the trigger. Years passed. Ray aged. The world outside moved on, but the lesson stayed with him. He had spent his whole life believing love was unbreakable. That loyalty meant something. That betrayal was something that happened to other people, not to men like him. But betrayal doesn't just break hearts, it destroys lives. He had let his pain, his rage, dictate his actions. He had thought revenge would ease the hurt, that making Henry pay would somehow make things right. But nothing was right. Now he was just another man in a cell, another cautionary tale. And in the end, he understood the truth. Betrayal is painful, but giving into rage is far worse, because love, trust, and loyalty can all be shattered in an instant. But once you lose yourself to anger, you don't just destroy the people who hurt you. You destroy yourself too, and some mistakes can never be undone. Maplewood never forgot the night Ray Johnson's life ended in a single gunshot. People still whispered about him, the good man who had lost everything to a moment of rage. Linda moved on. Emily grew up, carrying the scars of that night with her. And Ray became a ghost, trapped behind prison walls, haunted by the daughter who had once looked at him like he was her hero. Because love is fragile, and betrayal is a poison. But in the end, the worst betrayal isn't what others do to you. It's what you allow it to turn you into.